Welcome everyone to our session today, Targeted Strategies for Dementia-related Behaviors. So we're going to talk about some of the more common behaviors that we are asked about by caregivers. While these behaviors are challenging for those who are trying to identify how best to respond to them, we also recognize that all behavior has meaning and is typically a way of communicating a need. That could be a physical need, emotional, social, or spiritual need. So we want to try to reframe these challenging behaviors as needs-driven dementia-related behaviors. I just want to note that the session today will focus on specific strategies for responding to some common behaviors. Therefore, it is really helpful if you have attended our webinar or watched our recording on responsive behaviors before listening to this session, as this will certainly help you to understand the cause for some of these behaviors and general strategies for responding. The link to these recorded videos are at the end of this session. Let's take a look at our session overview. The behaviors we're going to focus on in this session are denial, asking for deceased relatives, paranoia, and the all too common phrase, I want to go home. We're going to share some brief information about what causes the behavior, and then we're going to follow it up by giving you some strategies for responding to it. I want you to think of the strategies that you hear on this session today as tools in your toolbox. So not all tools work for every job, and depending on the job, not all tools work well each time. Like dementia, what works one day may not work another. So try your best to remain flexible and patient when responding in the moment, and be kind to yourself. It's okay to make mistakes, and there's always opportunity to try again. So let's start off with denial. We often hear from families about the frustration of denial. Denial comes in many forms throughout the journey. Could be refusing to see a doctor or insisting that it's all just normal memory loss. And this can be expressed by both the person living with the symptoms and their family and friends. So from the person living with dementia, it could be, oh, this is just normal aging. I'm just getting old. Or the family member, it could be, oh, mom, I forget things all the time. There's nothing wrong with your memory. So denial is a normal and natural reaction to receiving bad news or anticipating something terrible. Think about it. Your family is telling you that you're forgetting things, you're confused, and you're just not yourself lately. That you've done some things that you have absolutely no recollection of. Then they tell you they want you to get tested. You need to go see the doctor. That's a scary thought. And here is where our personalities, individual unique personalities, play such a big role. Because for some of us, we will want to take immediate action and get to the doctor, while others will choose to procrastinate, to wait, maybe hope it all goes away, or deny there is a problem at all. So denial is one way of dealing with the fear of what is happening now and what may happen in the future. And then after receiving a diagnosis, denial may continue as a way to help manage a hard truth. Dementia is a frightening word and is often a misunderstood diagnosis that leads to more questions, unfortunately, than answers. And denial is there to protect us from becoming overwhelmed with worry, fear, and very sadly for some, shame and embarrassment. When we deny something as serious as dementia, we do so to minimize it and to protect ourselves. And sometimes we're actually trying to protect others who may be worried on our behalf. You know, you speak to older adults, and even when their children are in their 50s and 60s, they're still seen as their children and they want to protect them. Remember, denial can shift into acceptance for a while and then back to denial. And that can be very challenging for caregivers. But it's a way that we come to the truth of our condition gradually and in our own time. So while denial can be a way to protect ourselves or others, it can also occur because of a change in the brain. So as we know, dementia changes how we think, how we feel, how we experience life. The brain physically changes. It changes in shape, in size, in weight, how it works. So this all changes over time. One of these changes is called Anostognosia. And this is a medical term derived from the Greek meaning to not know a disease. It's used to describe the person living with dementia's lack of insight or awareness into their disease. Research tells us that up to 81% of people living with Alzheimer's disease have some form of anosognosia. It's not that they're denying there is something wrong. It's that because of the physiological changes in their brain, particularly their frontal lobe, that they are no longer capable of recognizing that anything is wrong. So the person might still see themselves as they did before the changes started. They may see themselves as someone who never misses a family member's birthday. They always remember. Other people rely on them to remind everybody of an upcoming family birthday. Or they could be someone who can look at a map just once and know exactly where they're going. And the new picture of themselves as forgetful or mixing up words, it's not able to be updated because of the brain damage. So they'll say that there's nothing wrong with them. What makes anosognosia even more challenging is that awareness can fluctuate. So we might fully recognize that something is wrong one day, only to deny it the next. And again, this is no different than when somebody with dementia has good days with their memory and bad days. Anosognosia looks like denial. That's the tough thing. But as you now know, it's something quite different. And it's really important information, because when a person is losing the ability to see their symptoms, we know that the brain is changing and it's time to pay attention and to respond appropriately. We mentioned in the previous slide how denial may be confused with lack of insight, which is when a person living with dementia has lost the ability to see their symptoms due to anosognosia. So someone with anosognosia is experiencing a different reality and as a result needs to be supported in a different way. They certainly do not need to be challenged or pressured to discuss dementia or reminded about how they forgot, let's say, to go to the dentist yesterday. Remember, we need to identify the need behind the behavior, and a lack of insight into their symptoms represents the need to pay attention. What you want to do is you want to consider this lack of insight as a red light. It's time to stop and examine how we relate and respond to the person living with dementia. The brain is telling us it needs a different approach. It's almost like the brain's communicating. It's saying to us, I'm having trouble with self-awareness, with decision-making, logic, and problem-solving. And as care partners, we need to make a change. I do want to acknowledge, however, that this is a very challenging and difficult stage for care partners. So considering how challenging this can be, let us take a look at some strategies that we can try when dealing with lack of insight. As we've already established, it's really difficult when a person isn't aware of their symptoms. This may result in them refusing medical exams, medications, necessary help, or even becoming agitated at the insistence of those around them that something is wrong when they think they're just fine. It might even become dangerous for some, for example, if they insist there's nothing wrong with their driving and refuse to retire their license. So, how do you help someone who doesn't think there's a problem? Firstly, most importantly, don't argue with the person or try to convince them that they have dementia. You're not going to win this battle. This is likely just to cause them to become upset. It's going to increase their anxiety. Instead, you need to help them to feel understood. They just might be less defensive if they feel like you're on their side. So for example, you could say something like, I would love for you to take the car out for a drive, but it's still in the shop for repairs. I don't know why it's taking so long. But hey, let's go for a walk instead. The weather is so good outside, and I sure could do with the exercise. Or, the doctor's just doing the usual annual exam. It's no big deal. Actually, I have mine next week as well. Hey, why don't we go together? I'd really like that. Also, you want to consider what language the person themselves uses to describe their symptoms. So, for example, if they say, oh, I sure get forgetful sometimes, then use that language when talking about dementia. And then make it about you. So what do we mean by this? Say you would like their support at your doctor's appointment because you love them. You want them to be there with you. You could plan to have both of you complete the memory tests. You can tell them you're concerned about yourself and sure could use their support. Let's say they want to go for a walk, but their navigation skills have been declining and you're worried that they're going to get lost. You can say, hey, I'll join you. Such a beautiful day outside and I sure could use the fresh air. This is really much more positive than saying, I'm worried about you. You're going to get lost. No, you can't go. Especially if they're not aware that there's a problem with their navigation. And this can certainly sound belittling. And this applies as well to getting help in the home. So if they say they don't need it, they're okay, which we hear so many times from care partners, that this is such a big problem, turn it around and say, it's for you. Some people are much more receptive of something if it helps the person they love. If cost is a concern to them, then tell them it's a new free service available to people their age. You want to use a term that we call therapeutic Phobin. So how do we use this? What you could say to them is, let's take our medications or vitamins together so we keep our health up. These days we've got to make sure we stay healthy. If you yourself don't take medication, just take a vitamin. Or we know of people that will just take those little breath mints that look like a pill. If they tend to listen strongly to what their doctor says, this is where you could maybe ask the doctor to help you and support you in doing what's best for the person, to write a fake prescription saying this person needs a meal service or they need in-home support. And then find ways for them to be independent. So important. And to continue doing the activities or tasks that are meaningful and important to them. And again, remember, it's about what's meaningful and important to them, not something that you think will be good for them. So for example, if they always used to pay bills by check, That was their job. They paid their bills, and now it's becoming a lot more challenging. Provide them with an old checkbook so that they can continue to do so. Or let them help with part of dinner, mashing the potatoes, stirring the gravy, if cooking was something that was always important to them. If you live apart, you could tell them that you're trying out a new recipe and you'd love to have their feedback. They were always, you've always appreciated their feedback, and so you're going to drop off a meal for them, and they can try it out and tell you what they think of this new recipe. Caregiver support groups and the chat boxes on these sessions when we have the live webinars are a great place to pick up creative tips for coping with a lack of awareness. As a staff, I can tell you that we never stop learning from the great creative ideas that come from care partners that we hear from every single day. So we're going to move on to our second behavior, asking for deceased relatives. One of the most common behaviors we hear about is when someone asks about a deceased relative. I do first want to acknowledge that depending on who the person is asking for, this might be a very emotional or even heartbreaking behavior for you as the care partner. If your mom is asking for your deceased dad, it can be another difficult reminder of his passing, which can stir up your own grief and ability to respond as calmly as you might like. So why do people with dementia sometimes ask for deceased relatives? So there might be several reasons. Firstly, the person may have forgotten hearing the news, but they will recall the information when reminded. This is typically amongst those earlier on who still have some awareness into their cognitive changes. Other reasons can include delusions. Delusions are false beliefs that cannot be changed using logic, or hallucinations in which they see or hear someone who is not there. Now, to those who are cognitively intact, it may seem very illogical that your 88-year-old father is asking to see his mom who has been deceased for 20 years. But to a person whose brain disease has caused their memory to take them back to their younger years, as far back as their 20s or 30s, then it's perfectly logical for them to wonder where their mom is. So before we talk about strategies for responding, I'd like you to take a moment to consider what it feels like to receive the news that someone you love dearly has passed. I just want you to take a few seconds just to consider that. That may have happened fairly recently for you, unfortunately, a long time ago. So consider if you had forgotten receiving that information. So we're talking about not a work colleague from 40 years ago, but somebody very important to you, and you've forgotten, and you had to hear that difficult news for the first time over and over and over again. So for people that have experienced this with their person, they might have received the following responses. Why didn't anybody tell me? When did it happen? I didn't even get to say goodbye. So those difficult feelings are relived all over again. Let's take a look at strategies for responding. So first of all, you want to consider where the person is at in their dementia. If someone is earlier on in the disease, they may remember the information longer than someone more progressed. So you may be able to say, "I'm sorry, Dad. Mary died a few years ago." And your dad may respond with something like, "Oh, yes, I sure do miss Mary. She was lovely." and then he may just move on. However, as the disease progresses, it may become harder to deliver that news. The person may get upset hearing it, or they may even challenge you on it and say something like, "That's not possible. Mary was just here. I saw her this morning. You tell her to get back here and stop ignoring me." The need in that time is for comfort and reassurance, certainly not details about what happened to Mary. The strategies we're going to focus on are more for those difficult times when you can't just simply remind the person with dementia about the death of their family member or friend. Their brain disease is preventing that information from being recorded in their short-term memory, so it's not sticking. It's not like they've forgotten, it's actually not even laying down that memory. And the news is too difficult for the person to hear multiple times. So we need to shift to a response that is guided by compassion. Those of you who have attended our education before may already be familiar with the term therapeutic phobin that we mentioned a few slides back, or another term is emotional truth. It has long been proved by researchers and physicians that reality orientation does not work after a certain point in the disease, and it typically results in anger, arguments, and frustration for both of you. So as the dementia progresses, the reality we share with the person with dementia decreases. So just remember that as the dementia progresses, our reality that we share decreases. And as sure as we are about what is true in our reality, they are about what is true in theirs. So it's important to remember that you cannot remind someone of an event if it does not exist in their memory. That seems pretty common sense, right? So for some, though, it may still exist in their memory, but the roadway to get there is filled with detours and blockades, and accessing that memory is so incredibly difficult. When we talk about ways of responding to various behaviors caused by dementia, we recommend following a 3-step approach to guide your response. So firstly, we want to identify the emotional reality. So important. What feelings are they experiencing when they're asking for the person? And how do they sound? Do they sound worried? Is it excitement, happy? Are they upset? You want to be observant and curious. Take your time to understand how the person living with dementia is feeling and what they might need. Validate the emotion by saying something like, "It sounds like you're very worried about Mary," or "I miss her too." Accompanying this with a gentle touch if appropriate, and this may just help to turn the person's attention away from the thought and towards you instead. Remember that for the person living with dementia, the worry or the concern is very real, and we want to acknowledge that. Just think about a time when you have been worried or concerned. You don't want to be dismissed. You want acceptance and validation that what you're feeling makes sense and that somebody cares. So you could say something like, "Mum is out with some friends. She'll be home later." Or, "There's a bad storm tonight, so he's staying over at Joe's house just to be safe. Good idea, hey?" You could say, "It sounds like you loved your brother very much. Tell me about him." And then we have distraction. Now, before we use distraction, it's so important to understand that in order for this to be successful, you can only do it after you've taken sufficient time to validate their emotions. You know, sometimes we are in a rush and want to jump directly to the step and offer all sorts of distractions to change the subject, to move on. Often it's because we're almost afraid that if we validate the feelings, we're not quite sure where that will go. But time and time again, validation has proven to be the key because it gives the brain a chance to share its realities and its worries, and it prepares it to switch gears. So once you've validated the person's emotional reality and what it is they're feeling, then it's time to move on and redirect the person's attention to something else. So for example, you could say, Mary isn't here right now, but I think she would love this shepherd's pie if she was. Or, what's Mary's favorite meal? Or you could say, I actually haven't seen him today, but if I do see him, I'll be sure to tell you. Would you like to go look at some pictures? In these instances, you're not lying. You're validating the person and telling them the truth. You haven't seen him. After validating, you are redirecting the person's attention to another activity, and again, typically something the person would find enjoyable. And you know the person best, so you would know exactly what they would enjoy. You can try using the situation as an opportunity to reminisce about the person. This is another great way. You could say, I miss John too. He was such a fantastic golfer. I remember that summer he taught me how to golf. How did you learn how to golf? You're using your knowledge of the person to explain the absence in a way that would make sense to them. So for example, if John used to take an annual trip to visit a close friend, you might say something like, oh, John's away right now visiting Joe in Utah. He'll be back next week. This can satisfy the person in the moment and just avoid the emotional hardship of hearing the upsetting news about John's death. And this is often a good strategy if the person is likely to forget your response and move on with their day. Of course, this is less helpful if the person tends to fixate on a topic and may wait around for John to come by later, or if they follow up a few days later asking if John is back from his trip yet. So if you're finding it difficult to redirect the person after you've already validated their emotional reality and nothing seems to be working, then you could try changing the environment. Care partners tell us that sometimes even just moving to another room or going for a short walk or actually a drive, a lot of people living with dementia love to go for drives, can really make the difference. Another question we hear frequently from families is on this topic. Should I tell him at all? So this is a personal decision that will depend on where the person is at in the disease and your knowledge of how the person might respond. However, generally speaking, everyone has the right to be told about the death of someone that is important to them at least once, regardless of their cognitive capacity. Sometimes we just never know how the person will respond unless we try. Where we recommend therapeutic fibbing is when the person continues to forget the news, or, as in the case of delusions, falsely believes that the person is alive and that there's some other reason why they aren't around, and that reason could be very distressing for the person. So in these situations, the factual truth can be too difficult to remind the person about over and over again. And arguing, as we've spoken about before, about whose reality is correct will only result in frustration or anger for both of you. So this is where we focus on the emotional truth. When you do need to tell the person living with dementia the difficult news, here are some suggestions. Try to do it at a time when the person tends to be at their best. Again, this will vary depending on the person, but for many people, this seems to be mid-morning, so sometime after breakfast. Do your best to speak with the person in a calm environment that's free from distractions. You certainly don't want to compete with a television that's blaring or whirling dishwasher. You want to be able to have the person's attention and that they are able to hear you. So you get the person's attention and you're setting the stage. You want to sit down face to face with them, if possible, taking their hand. And you could say something like, I have some sad news about your friend John. If you find yourself getting emotional telling the person the news, that's okay. We're all human. Your emotion may even actually help the person to understand what it is you're communicating to them. And it might even make them feel better to be able to comfort you in this shared grief. Next, we're going to look at paranoia. This is the third behavior we're going to talk about. So what is paranoia? This is when a person is suspicious, accusatory, or puts blame on someone else despite a lack of proof. So they might accuse someone of stealing from them, trying to poison them, or having an affair. So these are some examples. This can be, as you can just imagine, and if you've experienced this yourself, a very challenging behavior, because at times it can be so hard to distinguish if the person is telling the truth or really might be the victim of malicious behavior. You may find yourself in an uncomfortable position if you're constantly needing to explain to others that the accusations are not true. Even if in your rational mind you know the person has a brain disease and you try not to take it personally, it can still be very hard to hear these hurtful things, and especially we hear from spouses when they have been accused of having an affair. So absolutely very challenging for care partners. We're going to move on and take a look at some strategies for responding to this behavior of paranoia. So broadly speaking, when a new behavior crops up that requires a response, it can help to identify if there's anything triggering the behavior. So what is the trigger? Is the paranoia specific to one person? Is it a certain environment? Does anything happen before it starts? And does it happen at a certain time of day? So answering these questions may help to prevent, firstly, the behavior from occurring in the first place, or perhaps after it occurs, it can help you to come up with an appropriate response. Remember, we want to avoid arguing, and instead we want to validate the person's emotional reality. And secondly, they go hand in hand, we want to provide reassurance. So this can involve with agreeing with the person or accepting blame yourself and being an ally for them. So for example, this is what you hear from the person. Someone at the bank is forging my signature. So immediately you identify that the person is clearly concerned. So you can hear from the emotional response. They might feel worried that someone is taking their money or feel helpless that they don't know how to stop it. So as their care partner, you are their ally, the person they can trust to have their back and stand up for them. So some suggestions on how to respond to this. You're going to start by responding to the feeling. So important. Can't move anywhere until you've validated those feelings. You could say something like, that's a scary thought. And then you want to move straight to reassuring them that you will handle it. Don't worry, Mom. I'm calling the bank right now and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. I've got your back. It's all good. So once you've validated the feeling, you've given them some reassurance, this is going to cause the emotions usually to come down. That's when you can now work on redirecting them to another thought or activity by saying something like, would you help me set the table for dinner? I'm just trying to finish up this dish. We'll do one more example regarding accusations. So I'll use a common day-to-day example we hear about. which is when you're accused of stealing something around the house. So like a pair of glasses. Even if you know that the person has simply misplaced them, it's just not worth saying something like, "I'd never take your glasses," or "You're always moving them around, Mom. I knew this was going to happen. I told you you would lose them." Sometimes it's easiest to accept the blame yourself and say something like, "I'm sorry, Mom. I must have moved your glasses when I was cleaning. I'll make sure to put them back on the table next time." Or you could also reassure the person that you will find them and start looking for the glasses with them. Remember, you're their ally and you'll help them to get to the bottom of it. However, in saying this, I really want to highlight something. Like any of you listening to this session today who has been accused of something by the person that you're caring for, it's a difficult situation to accept. Even when we know that it's not the person, but it's due to the dementia, it still does not make it easy. And so just as much as we always encourage you to be patient with the person living with dementia, I want to take this time and this moment to tell you to be patient with yourself and to be okay to say, "Oh, I didn't respond well there, but you know what? Next time I'm going to try again." So let's take a look at our final behavior, that "I want to go home" line that maybe some of us have heard many times. It's probably one of the behaviors we get asked about the most. And so while this often happens after someone moves into a new home, it can also happen when the person hasn't moved. They might be asking to go home and be standing in the house that they've lived in for 30 plus years. To make this a little bit more challenging than it already is, home is not always what we think it is. So when someone asks to go home, they're expressing a need. Home may be a feeling, it may be a different time, or it may be a different space or time. So for most people, home is often that place of safety, comfort, and familiarity. It's where we feel most relaxed. When someone asks to go home, they need to feel safe and comfortable and secure. They need to be reminded of their loved ones, of happy memories and good times. When someone asks to go home, it means they don't feel at home. It does not necessarily mean they want or need to actually move back home. They feel like they are in the wrong place and they need to find the right place and find it fast. They need our help to feel safe and comfortable and secure. Remember, it's important to focus on the emotions behind the words to determine the need. Think about where is home for them. Talking about this can bring insight into what they're feeling and will help you figure out what is needed and how best to respond at that moment. So remember, reasoning and logic typically do not work when someone has a brain disease. So saying things like, "But you are home, this is your home," can sometimes really upset the person who may feel like you, first of all, aren't listening to them, or that you really don't care. And they may accuse you even of putting them in there. So here again, we're going to continue with our 3-step model that we used in our discussion of paranoia. This means using validation for a more gentle approach. So for example, "Yes, it would be great to go home now. What will we do when we get there? Who will we see?" So a conversation around home can be happy and reassuring. talking about home and the happy times there, reminiscing over memories and the people we have loved. This can be a powerful form of connection and reassurance. Opening up the conversation by validating the person's feelings and asking a question to continue the conversation is a good start. And once again, as we mentioned earlier, the vital, important point and aspect of validating those feelings. You could calmly reassure the person by saying something like, you know what, I'm going to talk to the doctor for you about this. Or, of course you want to go home. I would love it if you could go home with me. You know, the doctor said you need to stay here just a few more days until your knee gets better. Just a few more days. And this could be a medical reason that the person can identify with. Now, you might be saying a few more days for years, but when you respond to the emotional reality of the person rather than your own reality, right? So their reality, this is not home for whatever reason, you're responding to that. You then stop from becoming the enemy who is keeping them in this new place, and your relationship can begin to improve. Remember that the goal is to help reduce the person's anxiety or fear so that they can feel safe and comfortable where they are. After validating how the person feels, gently redirect their attention to something else. So, for example, you might ask them to tell you about their home and then guide the conversation to a neutral topic. Asking about their home further validates their feelings, and it may encourage them to share positive memories. So you might say something like, so what is your favorite room in the house? What makes the kitchen your favorite room? Oh, you bake cookies with your mom. I love it when we baked chocolate chip cookies together. So in the list of helpful resources, we have included a link to a list of conversation starters that might be helpful for redirecting conversations. Now, we know that sometimes, despite all your best efforts, the person will not let it go. If this happens, you may need to go further with their reality. So, for example, you could get them dressed for outside, but instead of heading to the car, you could go to the courtyard for a walk. Sometimes the change of scenery may be enough to help calm the person and provide you with additional opportunities to redirect their focus onto something else. Oh wow, Mom, look at those beautiful flowers. Oh my goodness, the beans are starting to sprout in the garden. So reassuring the person and trying your very best to use positive language when responding is so important. So for example, rather than saying goodbye when you leave, which could generate uncertainty over when you'll be back and cause anxiety, you could say, I'll be back to see you soon, or I'm just off to prepare dinner, I'll be back soon, see you tomorrow. If possible, set them up before you leave with something to take their focus off your leaving, like a cup of tea or a snack or a favorite activity. If the person you're visiting lives in long-term care and departures are particularly difficult, this is when you can communicate with the staff to see if they can help to redirect the person when it's time for you to leave and they want to go with you. Now, while we covered some examples of specific and targeted strategies for these behaviors throughout the webinar, I want to emphasize that without getting into the details of a situation, it can be difficult to provide targeted strategies that work for everyone, especially within an hour, because a person's behavior can be affected by their physical needs, their environment, their personality, the people around them, and many other factors. There is no single solution or response that will be applicable to all of you listening to the session. And that's why we really encourage an understanding of the three-step approach in combination with an understanding of who the person is that you are caring for. So a person-centered approach with an understanding and putting into practice the three-step model, which is validating the person's emotions, reassuring them that they're safe and that everything is okay, and then redirecting them to focus on something more pleasant. But still, we know that it can be difficult to figure out what's best to respond to certain things specific to your situation. So if you would like to talk to a staff member about more specific strategies for your situation, please feel free to call our First Link Dementia helpline and we will brainstorm more targeted strategies with you. Their number will be on the last slide. So as we come to an end of this session, I want to acknowledge that caring for someone experiencing the symptoms can be very trying and even hurtful. If it's at all possible, and I know this is not easy, take some time away from the person whenever you feel the need. It's important to remember that these symptoms are the result of the disease. They are not willful or intentional. And although some of the accusations can be so hurtful, again, try not to take them personally. It is common for care partners to feel guilty about how they may have responded in the moment, and it's normal to feel upset if a family member accuses you of stealing or infidelity. It's important to recognize that these feelings and these emotions are normal. You're not the only one feeling this way. But we do the best we can each day. Caregiving is a learning experience, and you're not in it alone. You will learn from our webinars and sessions like these, from our phone calls, calling the dementia helpline, and from other caregivers. And you're going to learn from your own experiences, and especially, unfortunately, because that is life, from your own mistakes. So I'd like to share a quote with you from the author David G. Allen. And it says, "Patience is the calm acceptance that things can happen in a different order than the one you have in your mind." So it's okay to take risks, try a new approach, struggle, and try again. You're developing a caregiver skill set, and this does take time. And on that point of time, I would really like to thank you for your time today in joining us for this session.